Everyone, and welcome. I'm Linda Haschef, the Executive Director of Opportunity Alliance Nevada, and we're really glad you can join us today for our final panel discussion. It's the final panel in our series of Pathways to Racial Economic Justice, and we have another really wonderful panel joining us today to discuss the education system. First, I want to extend a big thank you to our sponsors who really make this series possible. That's Charles Schwab Bank, US Bank, Wells Fargo Bank, JP Morgan Chase, the Estepona Group, Vegas PBS, and the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco. And a few housekeeping items before we get started. All participants are muted, and please stay on mute during the conversation. If you would like to ask a question, there's a chat function, a chat box at the bottom of your screen. And if you click on that, you can enter your questions into that chat box, and Tracy will watch that for us and get the questions over to Kipp. And for those of you who've joined us before, we've mentioned that the purpose of the series is to provide a forum to examine and understand the impacts of the past, discuss and explore opportunities for change and improvement going forward. So again, thank you all for joining us today. Before we get started, I'd like to share some information about our organization, Opportunity Alliance Nevada, who we are and why we do what we do. We are a statewide nonprofit organization, and we bring together resources and people from diverse socioeconomic backgrounds, and we investigate and understand the barriers that are faced by our struggling low to moderate income Nevadans, and also to provide pathways for them to self-sufficiency. We accomplish this through training, financial coaching, mentorship, education, advocacy, and continually developing partnerships and collaborative efforts. We collaborate and partner with public, private, and nonprofit organizations in an effort to build the financial wellness of their employees and the clients they serve. We offer trainings such as Bridges Out of Poverty, financial coaching training, and Getting Ahead in a Just Getting By World. We investigate, educate, and advocate for policies that provide pathways for all Nevadans to build wealth and economic security. So that kind of leads us to today, the final panel in our series. We have discussed in the past, our last panel series, or the panels before this, wealth disparities, housing gaps, health wealth approaches for an inclusive economy, workforce development and small business entrepreneurship, and the justice system. Today, we will be discussing education. So we do not view ourselves as the experts on these topics of racial economic disparities, and that is why we have invited national, state, and local experts to lead this very important conversation. We are happy to be able to convene this forum and bring the experts to the table. With the recent national events related to racial injustice, we wanted to provide a forum to discuss pathways to racial economic justice. Stand in solidarity with the fight against systemic racial economic disparities and the historic financial oppression of people of color. We are inspired by so many in our community who are using their voices and making change. We see you and we are with you. So let's talk about it. This is intended to be an open and direct forum for everyone. The focus will be on financial and economic factors. And we ask that everyone participate if they'd like and add their questions into the chat box. We appreciate you being here today and participating in the discussion. So with that, I would love to turn it over to our moderator, Kipp Ortenburger. So welcome, Kipp.
Thank you, Linda. Really appreciate it. Thank you to Opportunity Alliance of Nevada as well for assembling such an amazing panel. And thanks to you for joining us today. We really appreciate your time, of course, in this very important conversation. As Linda mentioned, I think the theme throughout our entire series here has been really the interconnectivity when we're talking about wealth gaps, that housing, health, healthcare, small business, entrepreneurship, criminal justice, all the topics that we've covered are influencing each other and connecting to each other that wealth disparities impact health and small business and housing and criminal justice and vice versa. Those disparities then can also cause downstream factors that then impact wealth as well. Education, of course, is a big part of this conversation, so much so that I think we could probably talk for days on this topic. We have to narrow it down, of course. We'll get to how we're going to narrow it down a little bit so that we can fit what we want to talk about in an hour and a half. As I mentioned, Opportunity Alliance has put together a great panel. I'd like to introduce them now if I could. First off is Nia Ariel Davis Sigona, Esquire, Government Relations Director of Higher Learning Advocates. Nia works to advance higher learning advocates' policy priorities and strategy with government, private, and public partners. She brings varied perspectives and experiences from the P to 20 education landscape, which include guiding the foundation of a state-based initiative to support baccalaureate-seeking community college transfer students, leading a policy and legal strategy team at the District of Columbia Public Schools, and examining equity and accountability with the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. Nia holds a BA in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics from the University of Pennsylvania and a JD from Georgetown University Law Center, where she focused on education law and policy. Nia also serves as a public interest attorney mentor for the Georgetown Law Bloom Public Interest Scholars Program and informally mentors many more students from her two alma maters. Please welcome Nia. Thank you for being here, Nia. Appreciate it. We also have Yvette Williams, Caucus Chair for the Clark County Black Caucus. Yvette Williams is a community organizer and political activist and is chair and founder of the Clark County Black Caucus. She initially pursued an entrepreneurial path and built a multi-million-dollar business and largest minority-owned travel agency in Southern California. After moving to Nevada, Yvette found her passion in social entrepreneurship as a political consultant, strategist, and policy advisor. She was appointed to the Nevada Department of Education Academic Standards Council by then Senate Majority Leader Aaron Ford, now our Attorney General. She also serves on the Nevada Department of Education's ESSA Advisory Committee and Family Engagement Advisory Committee, CCSD Bond Oversight Committee and School Justice Partnership Committee, and the City of Las Vegas Innovation and Education Committee. She also served as the founding board president of Progress Now Nevada and serves on multiple other education boards. I want to let you know I've had to abbreviate some of these bios. In all cases, the amount of awards and the amount of committee memberships is very impressive, obviously, with all three. So please bear with me that I've had to shorten them a little bit. Finally, last but not least, Angie Taylor, President and CEO of Guardian Quest and a Washoe County School District Board Trustee for District E. Dr. Angie Taylor has a long history of excellent leadership, people development, and community service. In the fall of 2014, she was appointed to the Washoe County School District's Board of Trustees, becoming the first African-American to serve in that capacity. Taylor has earned a doctorate in educational leadership. Additionally, she holds a master's degree in public administration and policy and a bachelor's degree in business administration, all from the University of Nevada, Reno. Taylor had a 20-year career at the University of Nevada where she served in several senior leadership positions. Dr. Taylor has also served as either a board or advisory board member for the Access to Healthcare Network of Nevada, Education Alliance of Washoe County, Northern Nevada Black Cultural Awareness Society, Junior League of Reno, and Nevada System of Higher Education. Please welcome Angela. Please welcome our entire panel. We really appreciate you all being here. I want to jump right into it and talk about, we're talking about wealth gaps, of course. That is consistently what we are talking about throughout. Education, of course, it's maybe more of straightforward context here. Higher level of education attainment means higher level of wealth, typically. But maybe that's not always the case. And that really is my first question here, is within that context, maybe there is a lot of other subcontext that we need to talk about. And so I want to ask you the question, and Nia, let's start with you. Why is education such an important part of this larger wealth gap and root cause of racial inequality and inequity conversation?
Wow, starting with the super easy questions, Kipp. Well, so from my perspective, and hi everyone, thanks again for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I serve as the Government Relations Director for an organization called Higher Learning Advocates. And our central focus is to support today's students and address federal policy to make sure that it responds to the needs and experiences of today's students. And when we say today's students, we're talking about a much broader range of students than I think are often associated with higher education. So many people will think about 18-year-old kid on the quad, throwing a Frisbee, just graduated from high school in a four-year degree program, which he'll graduate from in 4 years, get a job, never to return to higher education ever again. But we know that the truth of the matter is that people are moving to and through in so many different ways. Almost 37% of students are over the age of 25. Almost 22% of students are parenting. Nearly half of students are working half-time or working full-time while going to school part-time. These realities mean that the students that we're talking about and the students that the federal laws governing higher education address are not one and the same. And in order to have a conversation about economic mobility, a conversation about racial justice, we have to start with the actual experiences of the people that we're talking about. Policy is created to govern people, and policy is created to govern and to create foundational systems upon which the rest of our lives are built. If our education policy doesn't directly address the actual students who are in college today, who are working through post-secondary education to get a credential, to get a technical job, to get a bachelor's degree, to get a professional degree, if we don't examine them in their totality, we can't say that we're appropriately serving them, much less serving them equitably.
Yeah, absolute great points. Not only in serving, of course, the totality of the student, but how that student population is changing. Yvette, I want to ask you the same question. Why is this so important? Why is education so important to this conversation? And Yvette, you're on mute.
There we go. And thank you all for the invitation today. Really appreciate the opportunity to be on panel with your distinguished guests and be part of the conversation with the work that you're doing around wealth gap. I believe that's probably what motivates me most of all, having these discussions and reforms around education, because they are so interconnected. When we look at education gaps, those translate into wealth gaps. And those, we look at things such as diplomas, college and career ready diplomas, which Nevada now has as one of their higher ed diplomas. If you don't have access to those courses that allow you to graduate with a CCR diploma, then you're not really prepared for college and career as other students may be. Those impact your opportunities for scholarships, so you can even go to school, or even an admittance into a higher, a higher learning or a high quality college education. The other thing is prepares you for the CCR diploma also in the courses that you take. If you have access gaps, you don't have the same opportunity to those high skill, high demand jobs because you're not getting the same exposure and education as your peers. And so if you see, like in our case here in Nevada, African-American students have the highest gap, so it translates into the highest wealth gap. And we see that in our unemployment numbers, which are double white and Hispanic workers.
Yes, really important parts there, topics you're talking about, things that we're going to talk about more, bridging the gap between secondary and post-secondary and exactly what that means for career readiness, not only at the secondary level, but obviously in the post-secondary and then the career level as well. Angie, I wanted to come to you also. Why is this so important to the conversation? We're talking more broader about wealth gaps here.
Thank you, Kipp, and thank you, Laura, and all. Thank you, the distinguished panel. I bow to you once again, and really for putting this whole series together. It's an honor to be a part of this last segment. I can approach this in two ways. First of all, education changed my life, so I'm a living example for how education makes that difference. I mean, I grew up in a very poor family, very poor neighborhood, all of that stuff, right? But because I went to college, it changed me. It changed my opportunities. And here's the piece that we have to understand. It didn't just change me, it changed my family. Because younger people in my family, the generation after me, began to see that college attainment is possible. And then it began to change our expectations as a family. And we have a deal in our family now that once you graduate from college and you get settled, you pay for the college of somebody that's coming behind you. So we can have a legacy of college education in our family. That had to be intentional for us as a poor African-American family. You know, in the majority population, it doesn't have to be intentional. It's just the way it is, right? But when you're looking at Black, brown, and poor kids that don't get to see a lot of those examples, it isn't just that way. It isn't you go from elementary school to middle school to high school to college. It's just like that for them. So we have to be intentional about it. And part of why that's so important, one, it didn't just change me, it changed my family, because now we do have a legacy of college going in our family. But the additional part is this, what's built in, the systematic racism part of this is, as you're in the family, and because of the wealth gap that we live in, then it's much more difficult for Black, brown, and poor people to get a chance to go to college. For an example, African-American females make 69% on the dollar of white males, same job, same position, similar experiences and skills. So then you translate that to the home, you have less money to use when you're in the home. So then if your child does want to go to college, then guess what? They're more likely to have student loans. They're more likely to have student loans. So then that begins to take away from the only 69 cents that they're getting on the dollar anyway. And then they want to buy a home, which is where most of us in this country build our wealth, where research shows that Black and brown people pay more for their home. And so it begins to be this cycle. We have a higher interest rate for our homes, for our cars, and so it just begins to be this cycle. And so education, although it gives you that step, and now I can endure the cycle because I have a higher paying job, the cycle is still there. And that's why the systematic racism has got to be dealt with. So I really applaud the work of the organization of Opportunity Alliance of Nevada. I really applaud your work because it begins to address those things at the various levels.
Wonderful, thank you. So let's talk, of course, we've already kind of narrowed it down. We've already hearing some continued and constant themes here. We're talking about secondary education. We're talking about obviously post-secondary education to credential attainment for careers. Nia, you can do a much better job of explaining exactly what we want to narrow this topic down in our discussion to. Boil it down for us if you could.
Well, so I think that as my distinguished colleague Andrew was saying, having a sense of the various systems and how they overlap, intertwine, and are layered allows us to have a deeper conversation about how education specifically runs through all of that. I happen to believe that education, both from a perspective of higher education, which is where I currently work, but consistent with a full cradle to career pipeline, thinking about education as starting from birth, really, and moving all the way through and continuing throughout your career. It's an ongoing learning. And so if you're looking at it as the full pipeline and looking at these as overlapping systems, it becomes necessary to have a conversation from each part of the system, to have people who are recognizing various identities, various experiences, and centering the conversation on those experiences. And so when we're talking about the federal policy work that I'm doing, we're consistently reminding policymakers that today's students are not necessarily the same ones that the Higher Education Act, which is the main federal law governing higher education, I'm sure you know, that the Higher Education Act was last written in 2008. My boss likes to remind me and others that 2008 is when Beyonce's Single Ladies came out. So it was a different world, it was a different time, and like we can all kind of call back to that and think about where we were. But especially now that the pandemic has happened and our way of life has changed and will continue to change and we'll continue to try to adapt to it, it's more important than ever to consider the actual experiences, not kind of the fantasy that we have in our head about the way these things actually work.
I wanted to ask you too, Nia, on a national level, you're bringing so much national perspective here. You mentioned the Higher Education Act 2008. This is a constant question we've had throughout our series. How far back in history do we need to go to really understand what policy is affecting some of our major hiccups, let's say, in the system now? And I want to ask you that question first.
Sure. I mean, so I think that I have both the sort of lawyer's philosophical answer and the very practical policymaker advocate's answer. So philosophically, I mean, as far back as you can go, like we've been building our systems since the beginning of this country, since humanity decided to get into a social contract. And so there's a certain amount of recognition of what those systems have been and the fact that they have been building on each other for so long, that what we're talking about is not something surface. What we're talking about is something that has to dig significantly deeper into the foundation of all of the ways that we interact with students and with our society in general. From an advocate's perspective, thinking specifically about students, I think that some of our issue is looking back too much, and this is not to disregard the incredible work of people who've gone before and who've kind of laid the foundation for the ability to look ahead, but especially now in this time when the world is just completely different and no one really knows what's going to happen next. And we're trying things out, and some of them are working and some of them are not. And we need to be able to pay attention to right now and to look forward. I'd actually argue that if we're thinking about rebuilding systems to truly support students and to truly give an equitable treatment to them such that they can attain the sort of heightened economic access, it really is a matter of listening to what's happening right now and looking ahead. I'm interested in what my other panelists think.
Yeah, and I'll kick it over to Yvette. Looking at where we are now, of course, and when we look at Southern Nevada specifically, we have such a storied history here. Just look at when desegregation happened, one of the last states to do so, one of the last districts to do so. And then we look through, some of the reform that we saw in the 70s, of course, busing and Prime 6 initiatives, and then all the way through to affirmative action, every student succeeds. Yvette, how important is it to look back at that history, or should we be looking just at the now right now?
Oh no, I think we have to look at the history, because historically those structures are still in place. If they weren't, then we don't have to consider those. But we still have a system in place that is historically inequitable and unequal. And when you mentioned segregation, we can go back to that as an example when we talk about like racial covenants in neighborhoods. Nevada had those. There are folks, we actually had a last session, the legislature actually passed legislation so that property owners who have racial covenants in their deed of trust, saying that they can't sell their home to a person, of specific race, they now can go and have that removed out of their deed. So, and that's in 2019. So yeah, we've got to address the history in order for us to reform or dismantle an education system that was not built for Black kids. It wasn't built for them. And so now with desegregation, you've welcomed this community in, but all throughout this country, and I'll just talk about Nevada because that's where our work is, we continue to see the inequality, the inequity, and the Every Child Succeeds Act is so important, passed in 2014. It was passed bipartisan, so everyone supported it. But one thing that isn't discussed, and you talk about, policy, national policy and its impact to our state, there was one focus for ESSA, and for the first time to really deal with this system of inequity. And that was that every education department in every single state and every school district must make a priority of those student groups who are least proficient, because it wanted to deal with the proficiency gap. It says that those who have don't continue to have something better, while those who don't have continue to have worse, and widening the gap, which we've seen historically. I mean, we've got a very wide gap we're dealing with. In order for us to deal with that, we have to have national policy in place. So I commend Congress for doing that, but we have to hold our local districts and our state Nevada Department of Ed and our legislature accountable to make sure the policies they're putting in place serve the requirements of the United States Department of Ed and their ESSA and the Every Student Succeeds Act. So I just wanted to throw that out there. I don't want to take up too much time because I know Angie's ready to go.
We'll kick it over to Angie, and we are going to come back to both the federal side of policy, of course, but also state level policy, exactly what you're talking about. Angie, let's get back to the historical context too. I'd like to hear your viewpoint as well.
Thank you, Kipp, and I couldn't agree more with what my panelists have, or my fellow panelists have already said. When you look at it from a Washoe County standpoint, you know, the other part of the state, right, the other end of the state, I think in particular the historical context is important because, you know, as you know, many of you do. I mean, we don't have a very diverse population here when it comes to African Americans. I mean, our Hispanic, Latino, Latinx population is certainly growing very fast, but since we're more so specifically dealing with African Americans, I mean, it's slow. I was appointed in 2014, as Kipp said, and I was the first African American to serve on the school board. This was 2014, right? So that shows that we have some work still to do. And so in our district, you know, as our student population becomes more and more diverse as a whole, excuse me, just like in probably most of the parts of the country, the staff, the teaching faculty, the administrators, the support staff, it's a lagging, that's a lagging change that happens. And so what we find in that in districts such as ours is that there's a challenge in helping those, excuse me, that don't have the same lived experiences understand that it's important to value and acknowledge those lived experiences. It doesn't mean that you're racist by doing that. It means that you're human. It means that you didn't grow up. This is not the school district that you grew up in. Right? This is not the community that you grew up in. And so our unique challenge here, in my opinion, is that balance between we have to forge change because it's that time. We have a moment in time that is turning into a movement, and we want to be on the right side of history. You want to be on the right side of the movement, right? Not only because you want to, but because you must be. Our responsibility is to educate all children in this county. Whoever shows up, we have the same responsibility to educate them. And as Yvette said, some need more than others. Some have various needs. And so we need to serve all of them, right? Whether you're GT, whether you're special ed, ELL, whether you're poor, right? Or whatever the case may be. So our challenge is finding that balance and helping our existing faculty, educators, let's just say, which covers everybody, you know, recognize that it's a shift that has to happen. It doesn't mean you're anti anything, but it means we have to help you make that shift. Because part of it, people think, oh, that means I'm racist. Oh, that means I don't like black people or brown people or poor people or gay people or whatever the issue is. And that isn't what it means. What it means is we haven't had to deal with this before. So let's lock arms and let's deal with this thing together. So the history is important to say, you know what, this is not that. But we also don't want that in the future to be this, because it isn't going to be. So how do we do this thing together? Because we have to do this locking arms and doing it together. Because in Reno, I mean, the black population is like 4%, and that's counting boys, girls, dogs, and cats, right? Dogs and cats don't go to school. So we need to do this thing together. And as there's more of a recognition that it makes our community better, it makes our school district better, it makes our children better if we all get there and do this. And it's gonna be uncomfortable. Yes, it is. And there's no way to make it not uncomfortable, but that's okay. Let's lock arms and let's do this thing together.
And Kipp, can I piggyback off of what Angie said? Because I think this is important to understand. As you know, I serve on the Nevada Department of Ed's Academic Standards Commission. And it took 10 years to get multicultural academic standards passed in the state of Nevada. It took 10 years to get that. In that also was cultural competency requirement for recertifications for teachers. We got such pushback from a lot of our counties, in particular our rurals and other communities where there were not large populations of people of color, saying, if you can believe this, well, we don't really need that. As you know, we don't really have people of color, so we don't really need that. Well, yeah, you do. As though our kids are going to stay in our rural communities and where they live right now and not interact with people of color. No, you have to. And I love, Angie, that you use the term intentional. I mean, I use that all the time. I picked it up from Dr. Barton. You know, we have got to be intentional. All of this has got to be intentional. This dismantling must be intentional. And what our plan for the future has to be intentional. But we need all stakeholders on board to be intentional. So whatever they can do intentionally, they need to do it. And the having to convince people oftentimes translate for us as people of color that they don't care, that they don't value us, and that we're not important, and our stories don't matter. And so, you know, and that's the message we get as people of color. And don't think that our students aren't getting. That's the message I hear. We actually, the Clark County Black Caucus, we actually sponsor our Black Student Union Network in Clark County School District. So we have 28 high school BSUs, and we have 2 middle schools, with the new middle school coming on this year. And I'm going to tell you, the biggest thing we hear from our students, they don't feel valued, they don't feel welcome, they don't feel engaged, they don't see themselves in their lesson plans or anything they learn about, when we know that there's been huge contributions made by people of color in our history and in our world economy. And so I just wanted to throw that out because, Angie, you made that come to mind for me. And I just wanted to make sure that I messaged that, because I think that's important for all of our allies on the call, all the participants listening in, to remember, be intentional. Is there something you can do to help move this forward and to make this better?
And I think then the question is, how can we be intentional? And let's look at this, both of what you're talking about here, of course, collectively, how we can move this forward. So collectively, how can we be intentional? Let's talk about statewide then. If you are in a rural county, potentially a rural district, and you don't have a lot of African-American or Hispanic students, how can you still understand, or, you know, or how can we as a state more collectively help the entire state understand how important of an issue this is? Yvette.
Wow, that's a big question.
Missy, I don't know if I...
Oh, I'm sorry. I think that we have to put in place policy, procedures, goal setting, and we need to realize that even though we're in a rural community that are you know, up north, where we don't have as many people of color, that they are still contributing to our state and our communities. And so we need to make sure that, for example, on news media, for example, that we're telling those stories as well. You know, I know it's difficult when, you know, you're looking for a story and you're in a rural community and you want to reflect experiences. Those experiences need to be reflective of the community. And so often we don't see that. And so it's almost as though, and we called our free and reduced lunch kids, our Black kids within free and reduced lunch, invisible. Because everyone always, whenever you referred to free and reduced lunch, it was assumed you meant Black kids. Well, not all Black kids are on free and reduced lunch. So we need to be open to learning about everyone and their contributions. And so we should embrace our multicultural education, which, by the way, we still don't have it implemented in the state, and we were required by state law to have it in classroom this past school year. So we're still struggling with that. And I do want to just say, before you go to the next person, I just want to give a shout out to Regent Perkins, who's on the call. I saw her type a little chat, so I just wanted to recognize our regent on the call, in the audience.
And
I don't know if we could say anything.
I'm sorry, do we have somebody that had a question?
I do have a question, and this is Laura Griffin. My question to Mr. Anthony is this. Do the county have, or the state have, any cultural diversity training for your teachers?
Yes. So every district is required to do that training. This Nevada Department of Ed cannot dictate to any district what their curriculum will be. That's up to each district to write that, but there's certain requirements NDE will require in their curriculum, and it has to satisfy the Nevada Revised Statute. So what is required in that statute? Cultural competency is required in there. So certain courses, they have to take so many hours of cultural competency, to get their certificate renewed. So, okay. Yes, go ahead.
And I understand that, Miss Yvette, but I'm just saying, my question to them is, how often is that done? And is it just when the teacher comes in for her first training or her first orientation? Or is it done periodically every 6 months, every year? Because let me explain something. The way our country is shifting, it needs to be done every 6 months. Okay?
I would
6 months.
I would agree with you, Laura. And, yes. And so the requirement is right now on the books, by law, every teacher has to take so many hours of cultural competency training when they get their, renew their license. However, districts have taken different approaches. For example, at CCSD, we have an equity and diversity department that provides training around cultural competency on a regular basis. And so there's courses always offered for teachers to take, and it's up to them and their responsibility to enroll in those.
But do you see what our problem is, Miss Yvette? And I'm sorry to cut you off, but our problem is this, exactly what you're saying. Yes. We're all over the place. Everybody is doing what they want to do, and nobody has a consistency that's sending a clear message to our communities, to our African-American children, and to our teachers that teach them, that we are going to keep one message.
Yeah.
We have to have one message.
Yeah. And
that's
often,
why we're all confused.
And often, Laura, we'll have teachers who find it difficult to find time to take these courses. And so we've actually seen some pushback around the requirement to even take these courses. And we've had to push back and say, no, you have to take these courses. It's important for you to be culturally competent. So, and so it's a struggle. It's a struggle, Laura.
Okay, but then now my next question is this. I'm come from the East Coast, and a lot of things we do on the East Coast as far as when we have situations like this, sometimes we need school-based services, okay? Do you guys have school-based services in your schools? In any of your schools?
When you mean school-based services, are you talking about wraparound services? Like
that
food
is a service.
And housing? Yes.
That is a service that's in every school district, and they have a resource center inside the school district that every young person can go to and know about and can get anything they need when it comes to resources, cultural, anything. They can go to that resource center.
Not every school has a center. Some of our schools have a center and more in areas where they need it more, but we do have wraparound services in every school, whether that's the school counselor or someone that's designated to provide those services for those students who may need it. And we've put there's been a lot of policy around restorative justice. So when there are disciplines, when a child is disciplined, the question is, they try to find out if there's some other circumstance kids are struggling with that they can help with. So they are, and Laura, I have to say, this is work in progress, right? I look back, I've served on 3 different superintendents advisory committee, and I'm going to tell you, we've come a long way. If we were to talk about where we came from, and we talked about history a little earlier, if we were to talk about where we started a decade ago, because we've been doing this work for 14 years now, in education, trying to dismantle this system. If we were to talk about where we came from, girl, they weren't even capturing data by race or ethnicity. So we didn't even know what the gap was. So we had to start with, and so the legislature put a law in place saying that all data now for education must be captured by race and ethnicity. We expressed that because we saw we needed protection, we needed help. And so now today we have all this transparency.
That they didn't have that.
Yeah, no, they didn't.
Wow. Well, keep up the good work, Miss Yvette. I'm just want to commend you guys. Keep up the great work. I'm sorry to interrupt, but it was just earning on my spirit, and I just wanted to know the system. See, I got to learn your system.
Laura, I'm sorry if I could cut you off, but thank you very much for your questions, and absolutely, especially somebody that's coming into the system. You might not know exactly where we were even 10 or 15 years ago and the progress we've made. I want to bring the conversation more to the core of what we're talking about here, which really is that bridge between secondary and post-secondary. All roads are going back to the now. Very, very important. Nia, that's what you spoke to before. Let's go back to that. You've already given us some of the statistics. How many college students are over 25? How many have families of their own? Can you give us a little bit more idea of what the landscape of students are in post-secondary education right now, higher education?
Sure, and I'd like to kind of both go back to my previous point and wrap it into an answer to your question, Kipp, because hearing that exchange, Laura, thank you so much for your questions, and Yvette for your expertise and sharing your knowledge on all of this. A lot of what I was saying with needing to pay attention to what's happening right now and to looking forward is in response to these questions. How do we move forward intentionally? We move forward intentionally when we're moving towards something, right? We can only move toward intention if we know what we're going toward. And of course, that includes an understanding of the historical context, but it has to include something bigger and something better than that. And so to your question, Kipp, thinking about today's students and where we are, at least thinking about both the post-secondary and the kind of system of higher learning that both intertwines, the traditional kind of 4-year and 2-year models, but also some of the shorter models, some of the more technical models, some of the different ways that people kind of transfer to and through. We have to consider what do we actually want to achieve with this system? What do we actually want people to be able to achieve? And it can't just be the ability of people who look like me to be able to read and write in the same level as people who are white. It has to be more than that, right? It has to be more than simply closing the gaps. And I feel very passionately about this because, Angie, like you, education was a huge part of how I even got here today, right? Education was a huge part of what allowed my family, I'm of an immigrant family, and so allowed my family to come here, allowed my family to provide and to allow for me to have opportunities for education and therefore economic mobility that I have had. And so thinking about, attentiveness of right now, what is the data? Are we collecting data? Are we sharing data with each other on who is achieving what, on who is enrolling where, on who is completing where, on who is accessing certain resources, on whether those resources are accessible on their campus or near their campus? If you're a student parent, do you know about the existence of supportive childcare programs? Are there childcare programs on your campus? If you are working part-time, do you have the flexibility, especially right now, do you have the flexibility to be able to get your classes asynchronously, or do you have to do them at the same time as the professor is lecturing to you on broadband? Matter of fact, do you have broadband, the high-speed broadband that's required for you to access these courses, right? These are questions that will continue to shift. And I think Laura made a great point about, checking things every 6 months. That's the way we pay attention, is we're consistently attentive to what's actually happening, to what students are actually experiencing. And that's what we're able to respond to and to direct our resources toward. And I think that, Higher Learning Advocates has a slate of recommendations that we've been pushing on the federal level that include, making sure that institutions have the money to directly support students in accessing high quality broadband connectivity, or thinking through, if you are a student parent, you have these additional challenges, which don't just include childcare, but also include you helping your child to be homeschooled, include that child having internet access on top of whatever internet access you may need for your work or your schooling. It includes issues of basic needs and food insecurity, housing insecurity. There are so many people and students in particular who are talking about these these very pressing issues that like are the first thing that you consider, right, before you consider paying for your tuition. But we know that paying for that tuition is such an incredible investment that will pay such dividends down the line. We cannot allow for students to now drop out from under the safety net and lose out on the opportunity to close the gaps that we've been talking about.
Can I say something about that too, Nia, regarding
Absolutely.
what you just said? Because one of the struggles we're having here is around our career and college readiness diploma. You heard me mention a little earlier. Out of the entire state of Nevada, 225 Black students were able to get that diploma. That's it. And just to give you
What?
Yeah. So
are you serious?
Laura, let me give these numbers. So just to give you the numbers, and that's a big improvement, by the way, because the CCR diploma really has only been out for, I think, 3 years. I think we passed it in 17 and it became available in 18, if I'm not mistaken. So we had 225 African-American students in the entire state. That represented 5.3% of the diplomas that were given out. Our Asian population, 634, white and Caucasian, 1508. Hispanic 1514, and then our Native Americans was 12, multi-race 307, and Pacific Islander 61. So there is and then the other problem we have as that connects to that is because we're talking about preparing kids for college. If they aren't able to take those higher level courses to prepare for college, and be ready for college, they're not even going to get there. And then once they get there, are they prepared to stay? Are they going to be able to do the rigorous work? You know, what kind of courses are they going to have to take because they can't take college level because they're not ready? So that's the whole purpose of that CCR diploma. And when they first talked about it, we really had a lot of discussion with our legislatures around the concern that there was going to be a fourth diploma offered where we only had a small percentage of Black students receiving an advanced honors diploma even. So if our kids can't access these kinds of courses, these AP higher level learning, these career and technical courses, because they can't, it's a struggle for them to even get into a magnet or a career and technical academy where most of those courses are being taught. They don't have those courses on their campus. Then we're not going to see that translate into higher ed. And then again, we're going to see that wealth gap, right? So I just want to bring that back around full circle that, you know, it starts on these school campuses in high school, you know, whether even if the kids can even go to college or stay at college. We have so many kids that leave. They come home. I see them the next year. What are you doing here? You're supposed to be up at UNR. Oh, I'm not, I dropped out. What? So that, you know, we've got to do better on this end. And I will say this, you know, we work very closely with CCSD and I don't want to give the impression that no one's doing anything. They are, but it's not moving fast enough for us because every year that kids graduate and we haven't fixed the problem or at least seen some huge improvement, all I can think about is those babies' faces. How many are not able to go? How many don't have the future that they could have because their wings have been clipped and to rise to their excellence, you know? So I just wanted to say that. Thank you, Nia.
Yeah, and Yvette, I want to ask you one follow-up question. Sorry, Nia, and then I wanted to go to Angie also. The barriers you're talking about there, if I'm hearing you correctly, Yvette, lack of access more than lack of availability, I would assume in certain schools. We don't have magnet programs, don't have career and technical academy programs. Career and technical education, though, has been a big push. I know it's something that a school district like Clark County has expanded. What other barriers are you seeing then that are maybe disallowing students of color from getting into these programs or completing these programs?
So with the magnet and CTA, we've been doing the magnet was the very first issue that we really tried to address around accessibility. Recently, we've seen incremental changes in the criteria and requirements to get in those schools. Just recently, Superintendent Jara did make a change to criteria to remove behavior. Behavior was a big problem because we know Black kids are disproportionately disciplined. 3 times more than Hispanic and white kids are expelled. And so you can just, that application gets tossed out if you have any history at all of behavior. So that has been removed. That was a big deal, but it doesn't go far enough. We actually looked at the data for last year for our enrollment for this school year, and we've seen very small improvement. And so that's one of the things we're still working with the district on, how to really, and so one of the things we've recommended to the Legislative Education Committee in our recommendations is to go to a weighted lottery, where if you have a magnet or a CTA that is underrepresented by a particular subgroup of students, that they get an additional weight to the lottery so that we can try to deal with that disproportionality and underrepresentation and racial isolation on those campuses. Because when you go to those campuses, you'll see a very racially isolated population, depending on which one you go to. So, and so that will, if we can get a weighted lottery passed in our Nevada revised statute, so that those schools who are underrepresented must give a weight, and then when they reach the plateau where they should be, where they're represented properly, then they can go back to regular lottery. But I think we have to do something like that. I mean, like I said, it's been 14 years and it's getting worse, because as the majority with anything squeezes out the minority. So until you do something to disrupt that, they're going to constantly be squeezed out. And that's what's happening. And so there's things we can do. And again, it goes back to being intentional.
Angie, I want to come back to you and get your perspective on this too. Of course, the Washoe County District, of course, has expanded a lot of career and technical education programs too. For one thing, are you seeing disproportionality up there, even though you're dealing with a smaller population of students of color? And then also, what are some of the solutions you see? You've got a very robust community college network up there at Truckee Meadows as well. And we've seen a lot of workforce development, career technical education programs there. What are some solutions to maybe bridge that gap as well?
One of the things that we noticed is part of what Yvette is talking about, and I see Nia nodding her head from the higher ed standpoint, is information, the knowledge, the recognition that there's an issue, that there is disproportionality, that something needs to be done about that. There aren't more, let's say, Black kids in the magnet program because they just aren't qualified for the magnet program. It's because there may be something in terms of how we screen, how we have the accessibility that's being provided, and so on. So it really takes a courageous look, certainly back to intentionality, right? But it takes a courageous look to be able to say, let's take a look at where these problems are, recognizing that once you find the problems, you have to commit to do something about it. That's the hard part. Don't find the problems and do nothing, right? Find the problems, and even in this difficult, I see Sydney's question in the chat. Even in these difficult economic times, right? You begin to make some decisions, because eventually, hopefully, we'll be able to stop wearing face masks around here, and things will begin to slowly. It might take 2 years, who knows, right? But they'll begin to get back on track. So certainly you have to recognize that right now, financially, you're a little limited in different things that you can do. One of the things that we did up here, I think a main thing that we did up here in Washoe County was we put a task force together. Not just of people that are of color, or black and brown administrators and educators and so on, but a broad range of people from across the district to look at every single area that we have where there is to see if there is disproportionality. Yes, that always starts with discipline and restorative justice, as Yvette alluded to, but it also goes into what students are involved in we call it GT, that's our gifted and talented program. What students are involved in various CTE opportunities that we have. And when there's a gap, let's find out where that gap is. We have to take a really strong look at our, again, gifted and talented program to see why aren't more students of color involved in that. And that meant we had to take a look back and say, how do we screen? When do we screen? Where do we screen to make sure that's equitable? In addition, we had to stop that. Well, this is so-and-so's child, and their brother was in GT, and this kid is just a few. nope. It has to be done equitably, it has to be done at the same level, same grade levels for every child in the district. And then be willing to make some of the tough decisions and say, you know what, we don't do it that way anymore. This is the way that we need to do it. And they report back to the Board of Trustees. I think this is a really good time to speak to the strength and the power of the Board of Trustees. I put in the chat earlier, we require, now granted, we have our issues. Lord, we have our issues. So I'm not going to put us up and we get everything right. We don't, right? But I will say this, we require cultural competency training for every employee in the district. And we went through it. You have to go first. If you're the leaders, you have to put yourself through it as well. And there has to be a continual learning process. When this group comes to us and they report on an annual basis, this is what we're finding in discipline and disproportionately being included in special ed programs. Some of that is behavior. Let's take a look at that. It's not that this student needs special learning, it's that this student might have some behavior issues. And maybe they have some behavior issues because they need some wraparound services, or because of what's going on at home, or because maybe they fell behind a little bit. Now they're frustrated. So instead of saying, hey, I need some help reading, they act out. Research shows all of this stuff. And then they report to us on an annual basis. And then that's for us to make the budgetary decisions that are necessary to move that needle. Where were we last year? What are our goals for next year? So this is where your Board of Trustees can really help you. This is where this needs to show up in a strategic plan for your district. This is when you look at what your budgetary process is, because budgets are moral documents. People should be able to look at a school district's budget. Certainly there are things that we are mandated to do. Certainly there are restricted funds and so on. But when it comes to our general funds, people should be able to look at our budget and see what are the things that are important to this school district as established by the Board of Trustees. And that comes from our strategic plan. That should drive our decision-making and programming and budgets and support and recognizing, man, these things, this is not okay. We need to do better. So it goes back to all of that. A lot of stuff, though, in terms of this, if it's important to the Board of Trustees, guess what? It's important to the superintendent. If it's important to the superintendent, it's important to everybody else going along the way.
And as Yvette just mentioned via our chat, the enforcement of that, of course, is something we already talked about, and so very important at each district level. We're talking about board level policy, district level policy. We've talked a little bit about state level policy. I want to talk more about that in a sec. Let's go back to federal policy, Nia, and let's talk about some of the things that we can do at a federal level, again, on the post-secondary side, but to kind of bridge what we were talking about in the secondary school level here is that there really isn't a traditional school population, if I'm hearing this correctly. And that's exactly what you've spoken to also. Of course, we don't have a traditional student. There isn't a traditional pathway necessarily anymore. School, even a four-year degree is not completed in 4 years anymore. Something as basic as that is no longer happening. So I want to ask you, policy-wise, how do we make the system easier, especially for students of color, to get through any form of post-secondary credential attainment?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, $1 trillion question at this point, right? I wish I had a full answer, but the attainable answer right now with policymakers is wraparound supports. I think that especially given the moment that we're in, a lot of the fault lines of our social systems have been completely highlighted, right? People are struggling to keep their jobs if they don't have their jobs, struggling to get unemployment, struggling to access healthcare, struggling to access their education, struggling to access social services. There are so many struggles happening right now, and they are a product of the way our systems are created and are structured. And before the pandemic, a large part of my job was to go to the Hill, was to talk to policymakers and their staff and remind them that people are living their lives, that these policies are ultimately affecting a human life and the decisions and choices that person is able to make. And there's an imperative to consider the actual experience, actual being the current experiences of the student. So currently, students are struggling with food insecurity. One of the things that we're advocating for is that existing programs be streamlined with programs that students are already accessing through their campuses, through their institutions. So if they were potentially eligible for SNAP benefits, that the institution play a part in making sure that they know that, making sure that they know how to navigate the system of applying for SNAP benefits. If they are struggling, for example, with childcare, there are childcare support systems that exist on campus that, you know, are a little bit less applicable right now, as many students are not back on campus. And so what can we do with those monies? What can we do with those support systems that are already in place? And how can we adjust them to suit the needs of students in this moment? Thinking about, in particular, there's been a big push that we've been doing around internet connectivity, because as we've seen, it's baseline necessary for continued access to education. And this is across, you know, the P20 spectrum. And unfortunately, it's yet another place where there are existing fault lines, where rural students, where students of color, where low-income students tend to have less reliable access to internet. And so you're seeing reports of college students driving to McDonald's parking lots to access their Wi-Fi, writing entire term papers on their cell phones. That is not a way to help a student through to completion. And so recognizing where students are right now, our job has been, Higher Learning Advocates has been focused on making sure that policymakers understand the reality of what a student is experiencing, and making sure that those policies, like, it would be great to wipe out all student loan debt. And trust me, I am not saying I'm against that, having student loan debt myself. But right now, the immediate need is, how are you going to help these students feed themselves? How are you going to help these students make sure that their children are also accessing education? I think right now we're in triage still. And a lot of the federal policy that we've been advocating for has been recognizing that.
And maybe an extension of the triage, but also looking at the future. Let's talk about traditional school, 4-year degrees, bachelor degrees here, and then industry-specific credentials. Of course, we have in Nevada one of the highest unemployment rates in the nation right now. Of course, our unemployment is high across the board. Are there ways we can maybe change policy that way and make sure that we have more of a robust credential program for new industries, emerging industries in the short term, especially given that so many students of color are also students that are working, if not part-time, maybe even full-time at this stage?
Absolutely. I think that, and you know, we were actually, my team was just talking about this earlier this morning, that we need, I'm gonna steal my boss's term here, a Willy Wonka elevator of a system. We need one that kind of goes up and down and sideways and back ways and all the ways, right? Students already don't move through higher education just within a single bound, right? That hasn't been true for years. And so a lot of what we advocate for is to have federal policy recognize what the system has already shifted into. It has already shifted into a system where students are starting off in one school, realizing that the institution doesn't necessarily fit their needs, or maybe geographically doesn't fit their needs, and they try to transfer to another. However, that system is broken. We know that, you know, over 80% of students who transfer don't end up getting their bachelor's degree if that's what they were seeking. There are already students who are attempting to stack their credentials. So they may have gained experience in one place and gotten a credential for it, moved on to another industry or another state, and, you know, are continuing their education, upskilling or reskilling using different methods, right? There are boot camps, there are short-term credentials, there are bachelor's degrees, associate's degrees, et cetera. And students are already picking and choosing based on what works for them. And it's really a matter of federal policy catching up to what's already happening. And so absolutely, we've been advocating for a more updated system that kind of recognizes the changes that have already happened within student behavior, and again, are centered on students and their behavior, and are able to support them through their choices.
I wanted to come to you really quickly too. This notion of federal policy catching up to local policy, or potentially programs that have been implemented locally. Of course, our state, we've done a lot in our last several legislative sessions to improve career and technical education, work-based learning programs, and things like that. Let's talk about Clark County School District for one thing. Back to the enforcement. Are we seeing that legislature that was passed in 2017 is being implemented and implemented the right way in a district as large as Clark County?
No, because I think that it's difficult for them to do. I don't think it's not because it's not their desire. I think that when you have a system that's been around for so long, trying to dismantle or break away the infected part and try to, wash out that wound and put something in place that's going to make us better, it's difficult work, because you're not just thinking about in terms of what we need to do. You got to think about what do we have in place that's preventing us from doing that, and how do we get rid of that? And now you have to go up against folks who may be opposed to that change. They're not ready for that. So you got pushback from other stakeholders that challenge as well. So all these other dynamics going on. So it's not a simple thing. And so it's a process. But I want to say this about Nevada. We are setting the standard around this nation. We're doing things here in Nevada that other states aren't. I get calls and conversations often with activists in other states always. How'd you guys get multicultural education? They make assumptions what our multicultural standards says. They don't think, they think, oh, well, you got to deal with other things like racism and supremacy and things like that, and Jim Crow, and I'm like, we deal with that. Have you looked at that? I mean, we really are doing those things. We are looking at that in our standards. So our kids are going to learn these things. The next generation will be better for it. So they're not, and so this isn't going to change, and I doubt in my lifetime, but I expected it to change in my kids' lifetime. And, but I look at the work that's been done in education and the efforts that's been made. This is a community of activists. I want to say that for NIA. We are in Nevada. I've never seen such a strong activist community. And so, we don't do this stuff by ourselves. It's a community that rallies around. This last special session, when we looked at the inequity and the funding slashes for education that the governor had, where it disproportionately hurt our kids who are least proficient, our most vulnerable students, those are the students in the lowest 25 percentile, the whole community rallied. We had hundreds of people making phone calls and wanting to testify, couldn't even get on the call to testify, to ask our legislature not to cut SB 178 funds. Of course, they still cut it, but which hurt disproportionately Black students at a much higher rate than any other race. But we don't have time probably to get into those numbers. I would love to, but maybe for another time. But because I don't know where you want to go with this, Kipp. So you tell me.
Well, I want to go two places. First off is we have the most active, engaged chat that I've seen in these forums thus far. So I want to give our audience the ability to ask some questions here and maybe have the rest of the balance of our time to do that. But I did want to ask one question and go around the virtual table really, really quick. We always ask this question. We've got a lot of service providers. We've got a lot of case managers on the call or on the forum here. So if you have a family that could use some form of guidance, support, direction, where is the best place to go? Angie, let's start with you up north.
Thank you, Kipp. I think it really will depend upon what kind of support they need. So for an example, if people don't understand that part of our job in the school district is not just to educate kids, because you can't educate kids if they're unhealthy. You can't educate kids if they're food insecure or home insecure, as you begin to talk about our homeless children. You can't educate kids if they need some therapy and they need some mental health counseling. So all of those are a part of the wraparound services that we in school districts, right at the K-12 level, and I know this bleeds over into higher ed, that we have to provide. And I say have to because our job is to educate all kids. So if it's food, for an example, we have a great relationship with our food banks. And even when we shut down in the spring, we still had drops and families could still come. We have families that come to schools twice a week to get boxes of food. We still have those drops that are available, whether you are a distance learner or whether you're in the hybrid program, or either way it goes. We have those because elementary is not in the hybrid, but either way it goes, we still know those services are necessary. Now, part of what's a challenge we face is some of those food monies have now been cut off at the federal level, because you have fewer kids in school. So an organization here locally just did a big fundraiser to replace that. If you're in need of a laptop or connectivity, because we still don't have, we're 11,000 laptops short right now in the Washoe County School District. Now of course, we've gotten to a place where they can be ordered, but of course they won't be in until October, then the last bunch won't be in until December. So in the meantime, what happens to those children? Right, so if our local Boys and Girls Club is allowing students to go there who are in distance learning, or if they're in their off day for hybrid, for an example. So if you need help, you have to go to work, right? So you can't stay home and distance with your child, whether because you want them to stay distance because you're concerned, or whether because they're in the hybrid every other day they're going to be home anyway. Then you can get your kid to the Boys and Girls Club, and they have pickups. They also have pickups so that they can do some distance learning, and they have people there that can help kind of figure this thing out, because distance learning is more than let's just give a kid a laptop. I mean, it's a lot more than that. From a health standpoint, we have increased our medical staff at all of our schools, so that whether it's a COVID symptom, which is primarily what the attention is on right now, or otherwise, then your student has an opportunity to go and get some help. I mean, these are just real issues that people have. Our community has been pretty good in terms of, if you have an issue in particular related to COVID, you can get help with your water bill. You can get help with your power bill. If you just contact your the counselor at your school, they have a list of all the various resources that are available to help you and your family through these difficult times. And what I'm hoping is that now that the communities, I'm sure up down in the South, just like up here in the North, are recognizing that, man, there's a whole lot more involved and people need a whole lot more help, that this won't stop. You know, when we get to whenever that is, when there's a vaccine and we get through whatever that means, this whole COVID thing, that help is still required. People still need that help for food, for their bills, for health care. People still have those needs. So let's continue to do the work and not leave them out there by themselves.
I tell you, I gave you a broad question. I think you hit the gamut of every single resource that is available, and how to connect those resources. Wonderful. Nia, I'll be a little more specific with you. Let's talk about the reentry student in the era of COVID here. Somebody that potentially has lost their job and they're looking to reenter post-secondary. Of course, now there's financial aid issues, childcare, as you have mentioned. Maybe even more of a challenging question. If there's one place you can go for those resources, a one-stop shop, so to speak, where would that be?
Oh boy. I would love for the answer to that question to be their institution and the support services therein. Speaking about the kind of returning adult student, one of HLA's, one of Higher Learning Advocates' policy proposals is to change and to sort of allow for a reset of the satisfactory academic progress requirement for Title IV funds, so that students who have, stopped out, may have, gotten distracted by life and unable to complete their degree, through no fault of their own or their institutions, right? Just recognizing that life happens, are able to kind of use that flexibility to go back to school and have the support of Title IV funds, federal funding, to support their education. Because as you say, finding kind of a one-stop shop when that's a very large undertaking, deciding to go back to school, to dedicate your time, energy, and resources and money to this endeavor with the hopes of increased economic gain. Making sure that if they do decide to kind of throw their energy behind an institution, that institution is able to support them through that and able to kind of direct them to the other resources that may be available to support them throughout their entirety there.
And Yvette, I'll try to be more specific for you too, since we've been talking a little bit about the magnet programs, the career and technical academies, the CTE programs in general. If you are a parent and you have interest in this, you're a student, you have interest, where's the best place maybe to get guidance on the nuances of the application process and what schools have available?
Okay. And before I answer that, if I could just say, I did put it in the chat. So we do have a hotline number, 211. You can call 211 hotline number, and they will direct you to appropriate resources as well, depending on what you need. I just wanted to give that because that's something people maybe can remember, 211. And also for our students that are racially isolated on campus, our Black student unions have been excellent because our BSU advisors, oftentimes our students don't feel, like I said, welcome in their school. So they will go to the BSU advisor. That BSU advisor serves kind of as a mentor on campus and an advocate. I always say our students, Black students in particular, need an advocate because of all they deal with. These BSU advisors do an excellent job of making sure that they help those students navigate, whether that's preparing for college applications or scholarships or whatever, or just what's going on campus or in their lives. And so they're really great at helping those students navigate through. So I want to give a shout out to our BSU advisors that may be on the call. In regards to magnet and CTAs, there's an application process that will open up. Well, actually, they changed it. You used to have to apply at the beginning of the year, but actually they start taking applications as early as October now, and it closes in January. So you want to go to ccsd.net, and I'll type that in, ccsd.net, go to the Clark County School District website, and you'll see a link for magnet schools and CTAs, and you can go in there and fill your application. It's online. You used to be able to apply at as many as you want, but now they limit you to 3. And I always want to tell people this little secret about magnet and CTAs. You get the most students applying in that freshman year, whether it's first grade, because they don't do kindergarten, whether that is middle school or high school, 9th grade. Most families and students apply at that year. But what happens is you have kids actually not return in the 2nd or 3rd year. And so there are spots open. So you don't give up just because your kid now is in the 10th grade. You apply again for 10th grade because there's a possibility you can get in because there's an open seat because a kid didn't return. So, let's not just apply in 9th grade. Let's just keep at it until you can get in there.
Wonderful, wonderful advice. Thank you. Well, we've got some time left. Let's go to questions. Tracy, do we have anything in the queue that I'm not seeing?
We did have a question from Sydney Sullivan. Sydney, do you want to go ahead and hop on and ask your question about resources? Let's see.
Hi all, Sydney Sullivan from Chalky Meadows Community College. I'm also on the board for Opportunity Alliance. And my question had to do with the fact that I've been at TMCC now for 16 years. So this is the 2nd economic downturn that I've been through in higher education. And it seems like some of the services that are the first to go whenever there's economic stress are the ones that help our vulnerable populations, which we all know that our racial minorities tend to fall into at a greater percentage than a lot of than our Caucasian folks. So how do we protect those funding sources and say, look, we've finally got these students on the right track, they're on the right road, they're getting the support they need to be successful, don't cut this program. How do we do that?
Can I answer, Kipp?
Go for it, Yvette.
Okay, so now we get to our workaround policy, right? This is what we love most of all. So right now, all of the interim legislative committees are meeting. And so we just gave our presentation to the Education Interim Committee last week. This is the time when you want to have those conversations with those committees, not during the session. They're writing their bill drafts right now. They're deciding what's going to be a priority during that legislative session. Your voice is more important now than ever. So you want to attend those interim, and they just had their last interim education committee meeting, so I apologize. But next time, you want to at least attend one. You don't have to attend all of them, but during public comment, you want to make sure that you talk about what you just said or what's important to you. They need to hear that. You could, though, right now, even though they've had their committee meetings are done, you can still send an email or a letter to that legislative committee, because they haven't had their last work group. Their last work group is when they're going to decide on their recommendations. Each committee gets 10 bills that they can offer. The benefit of the committee bills is you've already gotten support from the committee. And when you go to the legislative session, it's the committee that decides whether a bill is going to move forward to the floor for a vote. So the best place to get have that conversation is in committee before the legislative session. If you now, we'll have to, February is coming up in 2021. So you can go to the Nevada legislative website. You can actually follow the education committee and look at the bill drafts. And if you, right now they're just very vague, so you won't really understand what they are. But as we get closer to December, they're going to start defining, they're going to actually become bills with language and text. When you see those and there's something that you want to follow, you can sign up to follow that bill. And every time that bill goes before a committee or any work is done on that bill, it will email you, send you an email notice and that is being heard or whatever, or being voted on, so you can participate. Or you can send your little text message, or you could call your legislator, or you could send an email to every education committee member about that. So there's things you can do to empower yourself and empower your community, empower your students, and then let your students know how to do that so that they can participate in their self-empowerment. That's what we try to do. We try to teach our young people how to empower themselves. They have to be an advocate for themselves today. There's not enough people out there to advocate for them. So they've got to learn that life skill set to advocate for themselves. Thank you, Kipp.
Yvette, great insight baseball of how our state legislature works. And I have to ask you, how easily accessible is it? Or if you are talking to a committee, of course, maybe we've watched too much TV and we're thinking of how powerful lobbyists can be in this type of scenario here. But if you are a person of one, a student of one that has something to say, is our local legislature listening, and can you influence them to actually change where a bill is going?
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. One voice can change City Hall. I don't know where we have, I guess some big corporate lobbyists tried to convince us that our voice doesn't matter, that one person can't do this, can't carry a load. That's not true. You are a voter. If you are a voter, you don't have to be, but if you are a voter, you have power in your vote. It's important for you to start with those who represent you. So whatever district you live in. And listen, a lot of policy can be impacted locally through city council or county commission. There's things that they can do too that can make things better when we talk about wraparound services, right, for our students. So when we go to the legislature, though, these legislators, they are a citizens' legislature. So they're working jobs just like you and me. And they are very accessible. But start with your representative, your assembly person, your state senator, and reach out. Call them, send them an email, tell them you'd like to talk with them about whatever. And you'll be surprised how easy it is. They're very warm, welcoming people, most of them. Some aren't very responsive, but that's okay. You just go to the committee then. You can pull up the committee list at the legislative website, and you can see all the committee members and their emails. So you can copy and paste all their emails and send a email to the entire committee and expressing your concern. you know, particularly around the funding issue that you asked about. I think that's our biggest issue is the funding. And there's a huge funding inequity in the state, hugely,
You know,
especially in education.
one of the things I would just add to that, since Sydney, since you're at TMCC, that's a great conversation to have with your government affairs person, because oftentimes when they're making decisions that have to do with education, then those government affairs people have relationships with the people on that committee, and they can have the conversation about equity and drop that. We need to continue to have this in mind, and oftentimes they'll actually testify at those committee hearings as well. And so certainly do the individual advocacy, but I would utilize those government affairs, some of Nia's colleagues here on the state level, contact some of those government affairs people, because in the Washoe County School District, and I'm sure at your levels, they're always talking to the people at the school district, I mean at the school level, campus level in your case, about these various bills that are coming up and how should you weigh in on them. They're looking from the way in. So that's an avenue you don't want to leave out as well.
And Angie's absolutely right. That is excellent suggestion to utilize that. But I will say this, oftentimes I hear the legislators say they want to hear from the regular citizen. They I don't know, because they don't hear from you often. They do hear from these lobbyists and the unions and all of that. They hear from them all the time. But when they start to hear from a voter in their district, carries a lot of weight.
I'm just going to jump in and say the same is true at the federal level. Anytime that you're able to make a story real, you know, I've heard someone say, a great advocate say once before, that stories are data with soul. So I could talk about as many numbers as I want to, but having an actual story and having someone represent their lived experience is truly invaluable.
Wow, great advice all the way around. I wish we had time for more questions, more answers. We are out of time. I told you we could have done 3 hours on this and still not been enough. But wonderful discussion. Well, thank you to the panel. Really appreciate all of your time and your expertise. Linda, we'll kick it back to you.
Thank you, Kipp. Thank you, panel. And wow, as Kipp said, this was one of the most engaged, publicly engaged panels that we've had. It was a wonderful conversation, and I know it could have continued for a very long time. First of all, thank you to Kipp for being such a great moderator. Our panelists, Nia, Angie, and Yvette, thank you for your time, for your expertise, for your passion, for your input. Thank you. And thank you to all the attendees for taking time out of your already very busy day to join us. And I'm not sure I mentioned at the beginning, but these panels are recorded. So you can find all the previous discussions on our website. This one will be posted shortly. And we will be planning additional brown bag lunch discussions. That's what this series was involved in, our brown bag lunch series. And we will keep you posted as we go forward. So please keep an eye out for our emails and for our information on what will be coming up. There will be a lot of really good discussions coming up in October of a whole policy series and one post-election. So we look forward to see you again, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day and stay well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm going to go ahead and end now, Linda. Talk to you later.
Bye-bye.